Here's the question: can democracy in crisis deal with the climate crisis? And I'm going to go on a little longer than my hosts want me to, but I could be very short and simply say, no, it can't, and step off the stage, because the reality is the world in which we live, democracy is part of the climate crisis problem, not part of the answer. And that creates a very serious dilemma, because obviously we'd like to be able to think the great system of democracy and the most urgent of all problems of the environmental crisis fit each other, that democracy is well suited to dealing with the crisis, but apparently it is not. And I want to subdivide this into two questions and then try to suggest how we might answer them in a more optimistic way, although the answer to the first two questions is very pessimistic and negative. The first question is there a rift, a chasm between democracy and creating a sustainable world? And my first answer to that is, as presently constituted there is, because we live in a corrupt democracy, a world of democratic deficit, a world in which democracy is associated with personal interest, consumerism, the marketplace, doing your own thing, impetuous quick polling and quick action. In other words, a kind of parody of what real democracy is. And in that world, our opinionated, media-manipulated, corporate-owned democracy is an enemy of sustainability, since in a certain overly simplistic sense, one can say, in a world where the carbon industry owns democracy, how can democracy deal with sustainability? So, democracy as currently constituted, no, sorry, doesn't work. It's part of the problem, and a terrible part of the problem. Poll Americans, and we know half of them don't even believe there is such a thing as climate change. They believe in foreign beings circling the earth and picking them up and putting things in their heads and putting them back down on earth. But they don't believe in climate change. They believe Obama is not an American citizen, but they don't believe in climate change. So democracy defined by the opinionated, media-dominated, money-occupied system that we call democracy is a very serious problem. And if we are interested in a sustainable environment, we better get on with the project of creating a sustainable democracy, which we don't have. But if the question is, can democracy, as properly understood by every political theorist who ever lived, by the founders, by anybody who cares about civil justice, about rights, is that democracy an instrument for sustainable policies? The answer is yes. In other words, if when we talk about democracy, we talk about deliberation, not impetuosity. If we talk about we thinking, collective thinking, common thinking, public thinking, and not me thinking, private thinking, what I want. If we think about a democracy of the commons, and one of the implicit points about the forest preserves and other national parks is they are public commons. They belong to all of us. That's so important. But we live in a society that has, for 30 or 40 years since Thatcher and Reagan, made war on the commons. Made war not just on big government and bureaucracy, but on the very idea that we share common goods, that we live in a common society. Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. There's only a bunch of individual market people pursuing their private interests. And under those circumstances, democracy can't work. When and if we were to constitute democracy in accord with the great principles by which it was originally conceived and designed by Rousseau and Tocqueville and the American founders and others, we would have a precise way of thinking, not short-term but long-term, thinking not about me but about we, thinking not about this generation but about the next generation and the one after that. Edmund Burke is often seen as an opponent of democracy. He wasn't, but he had a great term. He talked about the democracy that draws together not just the living, but the dead, the living, and the as yet unborn. The obligations of democracy extend to those who are not yet born. And when we think that way, we're thinking sustainably, we're thinking ecologically, we're thinking environmentally. And that way of thinking makes democracy a tool of sustainability rather than an enemy, or the enemy of sustainability, which it is today. But there's a second aspect to this question of can democracy in crisis deal with sustainability? I'd put it this way. Can democracy, within the bounds of the sovereign nation state alone, deal with the climate crisis? And the answer to that question also is no. Even if we fix democracy, even if it worked the way we intended it to work, even if it was really a democracy of us, of public citizens, thinking about the long-term perspective, the intergenerational goods of the United States, it would be a democracy inadequate to the challenges of democracy, the challenges of sustainability, the challenges of surviving for another 1,000 years on this fragile planet. And here's the reason why, and this is a point, and Julian talked about things that I would use the term for interdependence. The interdependence of the world. Local agriculture, as if it's a parochial term, local agriculture has an interdependent aspect. You can talk about African agriculture in the area around Washington. But that interdependence means in this 21st century, every challenge that we face today, every problem that is before us, starting with the environment, but going on to immigration, trade, technology, terrorism, pandemic diseases, and war, they are all cross-border, global, interdependent problems that challenge the whole planet at the same time. And we respond, even when democratically, to those 21st century global interdependent challenges with 17th century sovereign nation-state institutions that deal one country at a time with global problems. Even were China and the United States responsible for 35 or 40% of greenhouse gases, even were they, and they're both a very long way away from it, but even were they to get responsible and do something, it would make no difference. We don't face a problem of Chicago warming, of Illinois warming, of American warming, of Western Hemisphere warming. It is global warming, and unless every nation is in it together, no solution will work. And that's true of disease, of pandemic diseases. That's true of immigration. We're worried about the Mexicans coming across our border. The Mexicans are worried about the Guatemalans coming across their border. These problems are global. Immigration, legal or illegal, is about people seeking jobs, and the economy today is global. National immigration laws are national and local. So, of course, there's going to be a fundamental asymmetry between national immigration policies and the real problems of how to find jobs for everybody in a global economy. Interestingly, the so-called undocumented workers, the illegal immigrants, understand globalization and interdependence better than the national legislators who make laws trying to keep them out to. Because the reality is the reality of interdependence. But here's the problem for democracy. We live in a world, I have said, of trade without borders, disease without borders, ecology without borders, war without borders, terrorism without borders, technology without borders. But we don't have democracy without borders. We don't have citizens without borders. We don't have an environmental movement without borders. Even at its best, even when democracy works well, which is rarely, it is caught inside the nation-state sovereign box, unable to respond globally to what are global and interdependent problems. Independent nation-states, interdependent problems. The asymmetry between those is the source of our deep inability to address the problems. So what do we do? A, democracy doesn't work very well, and even where it works only inside nation-state sovereign boxes. Well, what we should probably do is all go and buy a new car, enjoy ourselves, let the pipeline go through, and figure, enjoy it while you can, because our kids and grandkids won't. But I want to suggest, being an optimist, being an American, and being someone who has thought a lot about democracy, that in fact there is another way. And what I want to suggest we do, and what I suggest in my new book we do, is that we change the subject. Stop talking about nations and start talking about cities again. Stop talking about presidents and prime ministers. Start talking about city councilors and county executives and mayors. Stop talking about large, bureaucratic, unresponsive nation states paralyzed by gridlock and ideological conflict, and start talking about the only real institutions that work, not just here, but around the world, our towns, our cities, our metropolises. And there's a reason they work, and nation states don't work anymore. For one thing, and that's a complicated issue, you can read about it in the book, they don't have sovereignty. They don't talk about, this is our prerogative, nobody else can do it. States have borders. Germany gets bigger, Poland gets smaller. Cities don't. Berlin and Warsaw can both flourish. And indeed, when one does, the other often does as well. But cities, in fact, are extraordinary institutions, much older than the states to which they belong. Think about it. Cairo's older than Egypt, Damascus older than Syria, Paris older than France, London older than England, Boston older than the United States. Cities have been here forever. And think about this. You can't close cities. Last fall, the U.S. government closed for the second time, and aside from the dangers and horrors it did for a few people, a lot of Americans didn't even notice. But closed Chicago for a day. No buses, no police, no schools, no hospitals, no metro. You can't close cities, and they haven't been closed, and no mayor would dare to close a city for an hour. Neglect a few streets being plowed in a snowstorm, and as de Blasio has already learned from the East Side, you're in trouble. John Lindsay basically lost his popularity in the 60s because he didn't plow Queens. You got to, if you're a mayor, solve problems. Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia said not so long ago, we could never get away with the crap they do up there in Washington. We've got to make our cities work. We can't stand on principle and say, I'm not going to do that because I don't believe in that. I'm going to paralyze. I'm not going to pay the bills. Because our citizens wouldn't stand it. Cities are where the rubber hits the road. Cities are where we live. And it's natural that we're more indulgent of the paralysis and gridlock of the nation state. Because at the nation state level, it's a great distance. It's about taxes. It's about war and peace. It's about distant politicians and bureaucrats. But cities are about us. We're born in cities, raised and educated in cities. We get married in cities. We get jobs in cities. We pray and we play in cities. We make love in our cities. We get old and we die in our cities. Obits don't say, Pete Seeger died last week in America. They talk about the Hudson Valley. They talk about the towns from which people come. We identify ourselves by our city. We have an attachment to them. And that makes mayors a different kind of politician, and that's true of city councilors and county commissioners as well, than national governors, because mayors are our neighbors who are taking time to do some work on our behalf and with us to make the cities we all live in work. That's why it's extraordinary. Trust levels in American cities and around the world remain at 70 and 80%, whereas the trust in the Supreme Court is in the 40s. President Obama's in 38%. The U.S. Congress, which we elect, has an 8% trust level. We choose the people and then say, oh my God, I sure don't trust them. Because the minute they get to Washington, we kind of feel we lose them. And that's what the Tea Party's doing so successfully. Except their people get to Washington too, and then we lose them the same way. But we don't lose our mayors and city councilors. They're part of us. They're with us. When Cory Booker was mayor of Newark, several times on the way to work, he got out of his car. Once he stopped a mugging, and another time he went into a building and pulled out a couple people who were in a smoking building and unconscious. Imagine the Secret Service letting the president get out of his car and run in and pull someone from a smoking building. You know, when there's trouble, the Secret Service has to take the president the other way. That's the way it is. Not so with mayors, because they are neighbors, they are us, they are one of us, and we trust them. And they end up not being very ideological. Mayor Bloomberg was a Republican, then a Democrat, then an independent. Boris Johnson of London calls himself an anarcho-Tory. I don't know quite what that means, but he kind of is. He's a bit of a clown. He's a libertarian, but he's a kind of Tory as well. But the real thing is he's a guy who wants to make London work. And whether it's Ken Livingstone on the left or Boris Johnson on the right, neither of them take their ideologies that seriously because London has to work. So cities are places that work. Cities are places where things happen, and cities are also places where democracy is still possible. If you want to look at some interesting things, look up Google participatory budgeting. It started in cities in South America in the 60s and 70s. Today, it is in many places around the world. It means you turn over part of a city budget, part of a district, a local council budget, to citizens and say, you decide. You spend the money. Where you spend money is really what political power is about. Share it with us. Participatory zoning is happening in many places. And participatory forms of engagement are typical of cities, whether we're talking about PTAs or church parishes. But here's the thing. If cities still work, if they are democratic, can they, as small democracies, impact climate change? Can they make a difference? And there's some very good news here, which is rooted in some very bad news. The bad news is 80% of carbon emissions come from cities. But that's because 80% of GDP, and these figures are global, they're not just American, are produced in cities. 90% of cities are on water, lakes, rivers, or seas. Of course they are, because, as Julian said, cities are about interactivity. They're supposed to be about diversity. They're about the connections between us and the world. And they are on the great tradeways and roadways of the natural world on water. They always have been. The Mediterranean, the Hansa League in the North Sea, the coastal towns, the great ports, the Great Lakes here. Cities are on water. They are interconnected with one another, which makes them entrepreneurial, creative. Richard Florida has written a book about the new creative classes. He's not talking about artists. He's talking about creative entrepreneurs, creative technologists, creative people who create community organizations. Creativity is rife in the city because in the city we come up against one another. The density of the city requires it. The diversity of the city, not always recognized, Julian, but very real everywhere. It's not just a few global cities that are diverse. Cities everywhere are far more diverse than what's around them. They may not recognize it, sometimes they don't like it, but they are. That's the reality. And that diversity, that imagination, that creativity, and the reality of climate change in their lives means that cities can and do make a difference. I can't do it here, but in the book, I trace the experience of, for example, Los Angeles, that under Mayor Villaraigosa greened up its port, got the big freighters and oil tankers to plug in rather than idle while they offload cargo. New York, which took the oldest housing stock in America, business and residential, and put new insulation in that saved about 10% of the energy spent on air conditioning and heating every year. Bogota, which put in surface lanes above ground that are like subways, corridored off, fast, good public transportation that took cars off the road. Hamburg, that has turbines, wind turbines inside of town, and zero-emission buses. And compact community zones where you intentionally put people even closer together to create a little more green space around it. Cities everywhere are finding ways through pedestrian zones and bike share systems and congestion fees and, yes, forest preserves and parks to make a direct contribution to a more sustainable environment. But even more importantly, they're beginning to deal with global gas emissions, with CO2, which is the real enemy of the future, and the carbon industry, which is the real enemy of the future. California and a number of its cities have set higher emission standards for vehicles than anywhere else, and that forced Detroit to make vehicles with higher emissions for everybody, because it's not worthwhile to do it just for some people. De Blasio right now in New York is forcing a higher minimum wage, not just for city workers, but anyone who does business with a city. And that will have an impact on workers and on jobs. Mayors can do it, cities can do it, citizens of cities, and remember the etymology, city and citizen. They go together, which is why Alexis de Tocqueville said, liberty is ultimately municipal. It's in cities that you find liberty. Schiller used to say, in the mountains, freedom. The reality is in the cities, freedom. That's where liberty, that's where diversity is found. So cities are in a position, one by one, but also together, to do things. And let me end by saying that some people have said to me, well, this is great, but you're sort of going backwards, aren't you? We started with cities, then we got these great nation states, now you want to go back to cities. And aren't cities parochial? Aren't cities just local? How are they going to deal? You said you need cross-border institutions. How can cities do that? Well, there's an answer to that too, and it's a kind of a hidden answer. Nobody knows. Who has ever heard of the UCLG? Anybody? This is an educated audience. United Cities and Local Governments. It is the most important institution in the world nobody's ever heard of, because it represents 3,000 to 4,000 cities that meet annually together to share best practices, to talk about common problems. And there are 2 or 3 dozen institutions like that, including ICLEI, the Environmental Organization for Cities, the C40, started by Bloomberg and Clinton, some other mayors years ago, which work together specifically across borders on climate change. One by one, cities can do a lot. Together, they can do more, and they're not afflicted by sovereignty and envy and rivalry and competition. There is, of course, competition between cities, but it's a race up, not down. Who has the best opera house? Who has the cleanest air? Who has the biggest parklands? That's the kind of competition we need. Not who has the cheapest wages, who can be stingiest, who can have the lowest safety and environmental standards on their jobs. Cities are competing in the other direction. So the reality is that cities can and are doing what nation states can't. 5 years ago in Copenhagen, 184 nations came there. That was about COPs 12 or 13 to try to renew Kyoto. After 2 weeks, they went home and said, excuse me, our sovereignty doesn't permit us to do anything. And every year since then, they've been doing the same thing, most recently in Warsaw. But that year, the mayor of Copenhagen invited 200 mayors also. They came and they stayed. And those 200 are now 2,000. And mayors everywhere are trying to figure out how they, within their own jurisdictions and with their own limited resources, can make a difference with climate change. And as a result, they are giving hope to young people who are cynical about democracy, hope to minorities who, as Julian says, in many cases feel the city doesn't give them the public spaces that are theirs. But the true public space we all need is sustainable public space, breathable public space. Public space that will belong not just to us, but our children and our grandchildren. And if you want hope, and if you want a way forward, join the movement in cities that, whether with forest preserves or limiting emissions or greening up ports or insulating buildings, whether with bike shares or congestion fees, or taking on emissions directly, or opposing fracking and the pipelines that are now crisscrossing America with tar sands, crappy tar sands, deadly stuff. Cities are taking a stand. And it's where we can take a stand, where democracy can take a stand, and maybe give the possibility of a sustainable world a real chance. Thank you very much.